Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in American history. Today, we'll delve into the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains, where, in 1907, a story of disappearance and mystery shook a small West Virginia community. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. Let's unravel together what happened to Catherine Morrison, the Appalachian. Mountains have always carried with them an air of isolation and secrecy. In 1907, the region was even more remote than we can imagine today. Poorly laid dirt roads wound between deep valleys and peaks covered in dense forests of oak and pine. Communication between villages was slow, dependent on horseback messengers and irregular mail. At that time, mountain communities lived in near isolation, especially during the harsh winters that made trails impossible. Greenbrier County, located in the heart of West Virginia, was one of those places where everyone knew everyone. Entire families lived on the same properties for generations, cultivating small plots and raising cattle on the steep slopes. Life was hard, but the people prided themselves on their self-sufficiency and community ties. It was in this setting that Catherine Morrison, a 32-year-old woman known for her skill as a midwife and local healer, built her life. Catherine was not only respected for her knowledge of medicinal herbs and care for the sick, she carried a strong presence in the community. Widowed since 1904, when her husband Daniel Morrison died in a mining accident, Catherine had to find ways to support herself. Unlike many women of the time who depended on the charity of relatives, she chose a path of independence. Her small wooden house, situated in a clearing near the village of Hillsdale, became a refuge for those seeking relief from illness or assistance in times of need. County records show that Catherine made frequent visits to families scattered throughout the mountains. She walked miles along narrow trails, carrying her leather bag filled with dyes, ointments, and simple instruments. Her knowledge had been passed down from her grandmother, a Scottish immigrant who brought with her ancient healing practices in the community. This gave her a peculiar position, one of respect, and at the same time a certain distrust. Some saw her as a blessing sent from God. Others whispered about practices that went beyond conventional medicine. The autumn of 1907 arrived, its vibrant colors dyeing the mountains red and gold. It was a time of preparation for winter, when families stocked up on food and firewood. It was during this time that Catherine received an urgent call. The Patterson family, who lived on a secluded property in the Elk River Valley, needed her services. The family matriarch, an elderly woman, was gravely ill. The messenger who brought the message was the Pattersons' youngest son, a simple-looking boy, who seemed genuinely concerned for his mother's health. Catherine packed her bag and set off the next morning. October 17th, witnesses reported seeing her leaving Hillsdale shortly after dawn. Following the trail that led into the valley, she wore her dark woolen shawl and carried, in addition to her medicine bag, a small bundle of provisions for the journey. The distance to the Patterson property was considerable, about 15 miles through rugged terrain. Catherine knew the route well, having traveled similar routes countless times over the years. What no one could have imagined was that this would be the last time Catherine Morrison would be seen alive. When she didn't return after 3 days, some neighbors began to worry. The woman who looked after her home during her absence contacted the local sheriff, reporting that it was unusual for Catherine to take so long without sending news. Sheriff Benjamin Fletcher, an experienced man who knew the dangers of the mountains, initially showed little concern. Delays were common in that region, especially when the weather changed suddenly or when a patient required long-term care. But when a week passed without any sign of Catherine, the situation changed. The sheriff organized a small search party and headed to the Patterson property. What they discovered there was the first indication that something was terribly wrong. The Patterson family seemed genuinely surprised by the visit. They hadn't sent a messenger to fetch Catherine Morrison. The family matriarch was perfectly healthy, with no ailments that would warrant a healer. The revelation was shocking. If the Pattersons hadn't requested Catherine's services, who was the young man who showed up at their door asking for help? And more importantly, where had Catherine really gone that October morning? Sheriff Fletcher immediately grasped the gravity of the situation. A woman had disappeared under deceptive circumstances, possibly lured into a trap. The Appalachian Mountains, vast and unforgiving, could hide countless secrets in their deep shadows. The investigation began immediately, but the difficulties were immense. Section 2. The investigation begins. Sheriff Fletcher gathered all the Hillsdale residents who had seen Catherine leave that October morning. Descriptions of the alleged messenger were vague and contradictory. Some remembered a thin, dark-haired boy wearing simple work clothes. Others mentioned an older man with a thin beard and a wide-brimmed hat. The only certainty was that no one recognized him as being from the area. The trails of the Appalachian Mountains were numerous and crisscrossed. Catherine could have followed any of them, especially if the messenger had directed her to an alternative route. The sheriff organized search parties that scoured the main routes between Hillsdale and the Elk River Valley. Men from the community, intimately familiar with the region, scoured every trail, every shortcut, every clearing where someone might seek shelter or get lost. Days turned into weeks. Autumn was rapidly turning into winter, and the first snowfalls began to blanket the highest peaks. The search became increasingly difficult and dangerous. The trees lost their leaves, leaving the forest bare and skeletal. Yet they still yielded no clue as to Catherine Morrison's whereabouts. It was as if she had simply vanished into the thin mountain air during the investigation. Sheriff Fletcher began gathering information about Catherine's life. He spoke to dozens of people who knew her, seeking to understand if there was anything in her past that could explain her disappearance. What he discovered was a complex portrait of a woman who, while respected, was also the target of envy and resentment. Her success as an independent healer troubled some more conservative residents, who viewed with suspicion a widow living alone and pursuing a traditionally male profession when it involved financial gain. There were rumors, of course, in small, isolated communities. Rumors proliferate like weeds. Some said Catherine charged excessive fees for her services. Others whispered that she used questionable methods, practices that bordered on superstition or worse. The sheriff knew he needed to separate fact from malicious speculation, but each conversation revealed layers of social tension he hadn't previously noticed. One detail particularly caught her attention. About 2 months before his disappearance, Catherine had treated a local farmer named Samuel Brooks. The man had suffered a serious infection after injuring his arm while working with farm tools. Catherine spent several days caring for him, applying herbal compresses and changing bandages. The treatment was successful, and Brooks made a full recovery. However, when it came time to pay for the services, a dispute arose. Brooks claimed the amount charged was absurd, far above what he could afford. Catherine, for her part, stood her ground, arguing that she had saved his arm and possibly his life. The argument became heated, and witnesses reported that Brooks made veiled threats before finally paying the amount demanded. He reportedly said something like, "Women who meddle in men's affairs learn hard lessons." At the time, no one paid much attention to his words, attributing them simply to the frustration of the moment. Sheriff Fletcher questioned Samuel Brooks extensively. The farmer had a solid alibi for the day of Catherine's disappearance. He was working on his property miles away from Hillsdale, and several people confirmed seeing him throughout that day. Furthermore, Brooks didn't fit any of the vague descriptions of the alleged messenger. Still, the sheriff kept feeling there was more to the story. Meanwhile, the local newspaper, the Greenbrier Gazette, began publishing articles about the case. The headlines highlighted the mystery of the disappearance, and the story soon gained regional attention. Other newspapers in West Virginia and even neighboring states picked up the story. Catherine Morrison became known not only as the missing healer, but as a symbol of something larger, an enigma that the Appalachian Mountains refused to reveal. The community was divided. Some believed Catherine had simply lost her way on the trails and succumbed to the elements. The mountains were unforgiving, especially for those traveling alone. A misstep, a fall into a gorge, or even an encounter with wild animals could explain her disappearance. Others, however, were convinced something more sinister had occurred. The story of the false messenger was clear evidence that someone had deliberately lured Catherine away from the safety of her home. In November, as the snow began to fall more heavily, the active search was suspended. It was simply impossible to continue searching the mountains under such conditions. Sheriff Fletcher promised to resume efforts as soon as spring arrived. But deep down, he knew the chances of finding Catherine alive were diminishing with each passing day. The missing woman had become a ghost, an absent presence that haunted the thoughts of everyone in Hillsdale during the long winter months. Stories began to circulate. Hunters venturing into the mountains reported seeing strange lights in remote clearings. Others swore they heard female screams echoing through the valleys at night. The sheriff investigated each report, but none led to any concrete discoveries. The mountains guarded their secrets fiercely, shrouding them in layers of fog, snow, and silence. The spring of 1908 arrived, bringing a thaw, and with it a renewed, if tenuous, hope. Sheriff Fletcher reorganized the search teams, now with a larger group of volunteers from neighboring counties. The case's notoriety had attracted the attention of more experienced investigators, including a Charleston private detective who offered to assist in the investigation without charging a fee. His name was Edward Klein, a middle-aged man with a reputation for solving cases considered impossible. Klein took a different approach to the investigation. Instead of just randomly combing the mountains, he began mapping every isolated property within a 30-mile radius of Hillsdale. His theory was simple. If Catherine had been lured by a phony messenger, then a specific destination was in mind. That destination needed to be remote enough to ensure privacy, yet accessible by known trails. The detectives spent weeks interviewing residents, asking questions the local sheriff hadn't considered. He wanted to know about abandoned properties, forgotten hunting cabins, old, disused mines, anywhere that might serve as a hideout or clandestine meeting place. His methodology revealed a complex network of forgotten structures scattered throughout the mountains, places that had been important during the timber and mining rush decades ago, but now lay in ruins. A particularly intriguing discovery came from the testimony of a retired lumberjack named Oscar Redwood. The old man, now in his 70s, recalled an old hunting station that had belonged to a wealthy Richmond family at the end of the previous century. The property was situated in an extremely isolated area, accessible only by a narrow trail that branched off the main road about 15 kilometers north of Hillsdale. Redwood mentioned that the station had been abandoned around 1895 after the family patriarch passed away and his heirs lost interest in the area. Klein and Fletcher organized an expedition to the site. The trail was almost completely overgrown, making passage difficult even on horseback. After hours of walking, they finally spotted the structure. It was a 2-story wooden building, surprisingly well preserved considering its years of abandonment. The windows were intact, though covered in a thick layer of dirt and cobwebs. The main door hung slightly on its rusted hinges. The interior revealed clear signs that someone had been there recently. There were fresh ashes in the fireplace, no more than a few weeks old, according to Klein's estimate. On a rough table, they found food scraps, potato peelings, chicken bones, breadcrumbs, but what really caught their attention was a leather pouch found in a corner of the main room. Sheriff Fletcher recognized it immediately. It was Catherine Morrison's medicine bag. The discovery transformed the investigation. Now there was concrete evidence that Catherine had been there. The bag contained all her instruments and vials of dye, carefully organized as she always kept them. There were no signs of a struggle at the scene, no obvious evidence of violence. But Catherine's absence and the presence of her most precious bag created a disturbing contradiction. She would never willingly abandon those instruments. Klein ordered a meticulous search of the property's surroundings. Teams scoured every square foot of the surrounding forest, examined nearby ravines, and investigated old support structures that had served the hunting station. For 3 consecutive days, dozens of men scoured the area for any additional clues. They found discarded objects, rusted tools, even some personal belongings left by the previous owners, but nothing that could shed light on Catherine's fate. On the 4th day of searching, one of the volunteers made a macabre discovery in an old, abandoned coal mine, located approximately 2 kilometers east of the hunting station. The mine entrance was partially obstructed by branches and debris, as if someone had tried to hide its existence. Inside, in the first few meters of the tunnel, they found pieces of women's clothing, a dark woolen shawl, identical to the one witnesses described Catherine wearing on the day of her departure. There were also fragments of fabric that appeared to have been torn with force. The mine became the new focus of the investigation. It was a dangerous structure with tunnels that ran deep into the mountain's bowels. Rotting support beams threatened to collapse at any moment, and pockets of toxic gases accumulated over the years made exploration risky. Even so, teams of experienced miners volunteered to enter the tunnels, carrying flashlights and safety ropes. What they found in the depths was never fully revealed to the public. Official county records mention only that disturbing evidence was discovered. confirming the worst fears. Sheriff Fletcher called a closed meeting with local authorities and Detective Klein after lengthy deliberations. They decided that certain details should not be released, both to preserve Catherine's dignity and to avoid inciting unnecessary panic in the community. The Greenbrier Gazette published a discreet article in May 1908, reporting that Catherine Morrison's case had concluded tragically without elaborating. Catherine's extended family, which included a sister living in Ohio, was notified privately. A memorial service was held at the Hillsdale Methodist Church, attended by nearly the entire local population. Her dedication, her courage, and her skillful and compassionate service to the community were spoken of. But while the community mourned, the criminal investigation continued behind the scenes. Detective Klein was convinced that the objects found at the hunting station and the mine had not arrived there by chance. Someone knew these places, someone who understood the geography of the mountains well enough to choose such remote and strategic locations. The crucial question remained unanswered. Who was the false messenger who had lured Catherine to her final destination? Edward Klein obsessively dedicated himself to reconstructing the movements of everyone who had any significant interaction with Catherine Morrison in the months leading up to her disappearance. He reviewed business records, spoke with local merchants, and examined ledgers from small businesses in Hillsdale. His goal was to identify patterns, disagreements, any indication of motivation that could lead someone to commit such a calculated act. A clue unexpectedly emerged from Dorothy Reynolds, the elderly woman who cared for Catherine's home during her absences. Dorothy mentioned that about 3 weeks before her disappearance, an unknown man had contacted Catherine. He claimed to be a distant cousin from Kentucky, interested in renewing family ties. Catherine welcomed the visitor politely, but Dorothy noticed a certain tension in the air. Their conversation lasted less than 20 minutes, and when the man left, Catherine seemed visibly distraught. Dorothy described the visitor as a man of about 40, of average height, with a well-trimmed beard and clothing of a higher quality than the region's standards. He spoke with an accent that was not typically Appalachian, more refined, almost urban. Catherine had never mentioned having family in Kentucky, which made the visit even more suspicious. Klein asked why Dorothy hadn't reported this earlier, and she replied truthfully that she hadn't thought it relevant, considering the incident had occurred weeks before the disappearance. The detective began investigating the possibility that Catherine had a hidden past, something that predated her life in Hillsdale. He discovered that she had arrived in the area in 1899, accompanied by her then-husband, Daniel Morrison. The couple had come from Eastern Virginia and quickly established themselves in the community. Daniel had worked in the local coal mines until his accidental death in 1904, and Catherine, already versed in the healing arts, had taken up her role as a healer soon after becoming a widow. Klein sent telegrams to authorities in several Eastern Virginia towns, seeking information about Catherine's past before her arrival in the mountains. The most significant response came from an Augusta County sheriff, reporting that a woman with a similar name and description had worked at a charity hospital in Staunton during 1896. 1897. She had left her job abruptly, and there were records that a lawsuit had been filed against her by a local family, though details were scant and the case apparently never concluded. Klein personally traveled to Staunton, a several-day journey through mountainous terrain. There he managed to locate records from the former hospital, which no longer existed as a charity and had been converted into a municipal facility. The records revealed that Catherine, then using her maiden name, Catherine Harper, had been accused by a wealthy family of causing their patriarch's death through inadequate treatment. The story was complex. Mr. Gregory Ashford, a prominent Staunton merchant, had contracted a severe fever. Catherine, then working as a nurse at the hospital, was assigned to his care. During his treatment, she administered a series of medications prescribed by the attending physician. However, when Ashford died 3 days later, the family alleged that Catherine had made serious errors in the dosage, administering excessive amounts that accelerated his decline. The Ashford family's lawsuit never reached trial. Records showed that after weeks of legal preparations, the case was suddenly dismissed. There was no clear explanation in the documents, only a brief notation indicating that the parties had reached a private settlement. Klein attempted to locate members of the Ashford family, but discovered that most had moved away from Staunton in the following years, scattering across different states. There was, however, one exception. Gregory Ashford's youngest son, a man named Vincent Ashford, still resided in the area. Klein managed to locate him at a rural property on the outskirts of town. Vincent, now approximately 45 years old, initially greeted the detective with suspicion, but agreed to discuss the events of more than a decade ago. Vincent revealed details not in the official records. He explained that his family had always believed Catherine Harper had been negligent in caring for his father, but that there was no concrete evidence of intentional misconduct. The attending physician had defended the nurse, attesting that she had followed all his instructions correctly. Gregory's death, according to the doctor, had resulted from the severity of the disease itself, not from treatment errors. However, Vincent admitted that his older brother, Lawrence Ashford, never accepted. Lawrence was convinced that Catherine had deliberately killed their father, though he couldn't prove it or explain her motive. When the case was dismissed due to a lack of substantial evidence, Lawrence was furious. He vowed to seek justice himself, according to Vincent. But the family interpreted it as the emotional outburst of a grieving man. Klein asked where Lawrence Ashford could be found. Vincent hesitated before answering, his face showing a mixture of concern and embarrassment. He revealed that Lawrence had developed a deep obsession with the case over the years. After the family forced the dismissal of the lawsuit, Lawrence distanced himself from his relatives, refusing to accept any reconciliation. Vincent had lost contact with his brother around 19, but he had heard rumors that Lawrence wandered the Virginia countryside, living off odd jobs and constantly on the move. Vincent's description of his brother matched unsettlingly Dorothy Reynolds's description of the supposed cousin who had visited Catherine in Hillsdale. He was of medium height, had a well-groomed beard, and had refined manners that contrasted with his apparent itinerant status. Klein felt a shiver run down his spine. Was he finally confronting the man responsible for Catherine Morrison's disappearance? Klein returned to Hillsdale with crucial information, but also an investigative dilemma. Lawrence Ashford was now the prime suspect, but his whereabouts were completely unknown. The detective shared his findings with Sheriff Fletcher, and together they devised a plan to track the man. Circulars were distributed to sheriffs throughout West Virginia and neighboring states, containing Lawrence's description and requesting information on his whereabouts. While waiting for answers, Klein decided to revisit every location connected to the case. He returned to the old hunting lodge, examining every inch of the property with fresh eyes. This time, he wasn't just looking for physical evidence, but also trying to understand the mind of someone who had so carefully planned this crime. The choice of this particular location wasn't random. Whoever had brought Catherine there was intimately familiar with the geography of the Appalachian Mountains. During his meticulous search, Klein found something he had previously overlooked. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, hidden beneath loose floorboards, lay a small diary bound in worn leather. The pages were yellowed and stained from damp, but still legible. The handwriting was masculine, firm, and slanted. There was no name identifying the author, but the entries dated from 1905 to 1907. The diary revealed the troubled thoughts of someone consumed by revenge. The author wrote about a woman he called only her, describing her as responsible for an irreparable tragedy in his life. The opening pages contained philosophical reflections on justice and retribution, questioning whether human law was sufficient to punish certain transgressions. Gradually, the tone became darker, more determined. In an entry dated July 1906, the author mentioned having finally located her after years of searching. He described the Appalachian Mountains as the perfect place, isolated and unforgiving, where secrets could be buried forever. There were crude sketch maps in the margins of some pages, showing trails and landmarks that Klein recognized as belonging to the region around Hillsdale. The author's obsession was evident in every carefully recorded word. One particularly revealing passage read, "Patience is the virtue of the just. I watch her movements. I learn her routines. I understand her weaknesses. She does not suspect that the past has found her. Soon there will be balance. What was taken will be restored, not through return, but through equivalence." Klein recognized in these words the mindset of someone who saw her act not as a crime, but as righting a cosmic injustice. The last diary entry was dated October 1907, just 2 days before Catherine's disappearance. The text was brief and conclusive. "Tomorrow the bill will finally be paid. Years of waiting, of planning, of holding back will culminate in the moment I always knew would come. There is no pleasure in it, only necessity. May she understand in her final moments that actions have consequences that echo through time." Klein felt a sinking feeling in his stomach as he read those words. The diary was essentially a confession, though it didn't explicitly mention names. He took the document to Hillsdale and showed it to Sheriff Fletcher. They both agreed they needed to definitively confirm that the author was Lawrence Ashford. To do that, they needed a sample of Lawrence's handwriting for comparison. The detective sent another telegram to Vincent Ashford, requesting any documents written by his brother that might still exist. Vincent replied that he had saved some old letters Lawrence had sent to the family before the complete breakup. He agreed to mail them to Hillsdale. The weeks of waiting were agonizing for Klein, who felt he was so close to solving the case, but still awaiting final confirmation. While waiting, responses arrived from several sheriffs in other localities. Several reported sightings of men matching Lawrence Ashford's description, but none could definitively confirm his identity. A Monroe County sheriff reported that a man with similar characteristics had temporarily worked at a sawmill during the summer of 1907, but disappeared without warning in September. Another report came from Greenbrier County, mentioning an itinerant laborer who had helped harvest crops on several farms during that same period. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Lawrence Ashford, if it was indeed him, had been moving around the area for months, gradually moving closer to Hillsdale. He had worked in various locations temporarily, always keeping a low profile, always moving before people started asking questions. It was the behavior of someone who wanted to leave no trace, of someone planning something that required invisibility. When Lawrence's letters finally arrived, Klein immediately compared them with the diary's handwriting. The correspondence was unmistakable. The specific way Lawrence formed certain letters, the characteristic slant of his writing, the peculiar strokes on certain words, all matched perfectly. The diary's author was undoubtedly Lawrence Ashford, and the diary's contents constituted clear evidence of premeditation and intent. Sheriff Fletcher issued an arrest warrant for Lawrence Ashford for murder. Copies were distributed throughout the region and sent to neighboring states. Lawrence's detailed description was published in local and regional newspapers. The Greenbrier Gazette devoted its front page to revealing that a suspect had been identified in the Catherine Morrison case, though without disclosing the most disturbing details found in the diary. The Hillsdale community reacted with a mixture of relief and unease. Relief that there was finally progress in the investigation, but unease at the realization that a man driven by vengeance had lived among them, watching, planning, waiting for the right moment. People began to recall chance encounters with strangers during those months, each wondering if they had crossed paths with Lawrence without realizing his true nature. Dorothy Reynolds, in particular, was shaken to learn that the supposed cousin who had visited Catherine was likely the man responsible for her disappearance. She recalled details of that visit that had previously seemed insignificant, but now took on new meaning. The way Lawrence had observed the house, the way he had asked subtle questions about Catherine's routine, the way he had mentally noted every piece of information innocently shared during their conversation. The following months were marked by an intense manhunt for Lawrence Ashford. Klein remained in Hillsdale, coordinating the search efforts and investigating every lead that emerged. Reports of sightings came in weekly from various locations, but by the time authorities arrived at the indicated location, Lawrence had disappeared again. It was as if he possessed a supernatural instinct for detecting danger, always one step ahead of his pursuers. In August 1908, a significant development occurred in Randolph County, approximately 50 miles north of Hillsdale. A group of loggers found a makeshift cabin in the woods, clearly inhabited until very recently. Inside were a few personal belongings, including men's clothing, basic cooking utensils, and most significantly, a copy of the May issue of the Greenbrier Gazette, the very issue that carried the news about the progress of the investigation into the Catherine Morrison case. The newspaper was carefully folded to the article's designated page, with repeated reading marks visible on the paper. In the margins, someone had scribbled notes in tiny handwriting. One read, "They will never understand justice." Another more cryptic, "The burden of conscience is only for those who carry guilt." The handwriting matched that of Lawrence Ashford. He was aware he was wanted and apparently showed no remorse. Klein analyzed the cabin's location and the emerging movement pattern. Lawrence was moving north, deeper into the Appalachian Mountains. The detective theorized that the fugitive intended to eventually cross into Maryland or Pennsylvania, where he could disappear completely into a large city like Baltimore or Pittsburgh. Once absorbed into the urban crowds, he would be nearly impossible to find. Authorities stepped up surveillance on major routes leading to the northern states. Checkpoints were set up on major roads, and local sheriffs were instructed to question any man traveling alone who matched Lawrence's description. The strategy yielded some results, with several individuals being temporarily detained for questioning, but none of them turned out to be the man sought. During this period, Klein received an unexpected letter. It arrived through the Hillsdale post office, with no return address, posted in a small village called Helvetia, known for its predominantly Swiss population. The letter was addressed directly to the detective, and the handwriting was unmistakable. Lawrence Ashford was deliberately contacting his stalker. The letter's content was disturbing in its calm rationality. Lawrence wrote, "Mr. Klein, I acknowledge your dedication to this investigation. Your persistence is admirable, though misguided in its purpose. You pursue me as if I were a common criminal, but you fail to understand that I am the enforcer of a justice the legal system failed to deliver. Catherine Harper took my father from me through negligence or worse. She escaped consequences, changed her name, and rebuilt her life as if nothing had happened. This was unacceptable." The letter continued for several pages, detailing Lawrence's perspective on the events. He described how he spent years investigating his father's death, how he discovered inconsistencies in the doctor's statements, and how he found evidence suggesting Catherine possessed knowledge a mere nurse should not have. According to Lawrence, she had experimented with unconventional treatments, using Gregory Ashford as an unwitting subject, resulting in his untimely death. Lawrence wrote about how he had located Catherine in Hillsdale after years of meticulous searching. He had worked various odd jobs around the area, gradually getting closer, observing her from afar. The visit he had made to her home, introducing himself as a distant cousin, had been a test. He wanted to look her in the eye, see if she would show any sign of recognition or remorse. He saw none. For Lawrence, this confirmed that she was devoid of conscience, deserving of the fate he had planned. The letter contained no explicit confession about what had happened to Catherine on that fateful October morning. Lawrence kept his statements vague and philosophical, avoiding specific details that could be used legally against him. It ended with a cold declaration: "Do not expect to find me, Mr. Klein. These mountains know my name and protect me. When true justice is served, even the stones conspire in your favor. You may continue your search, but know that you pursue not a man, but a principle." Sheriff Fletcher was furious when he read the letter. To him, it was an arrogant provocation from a killer trying to justify the unjustifiable. Klein, though equally determined to capture Lawrence, recognized that they were dealing with someone extraordinarily intelligent and psychologically complex. Lawrence was not an impulsive criminal, but a man who had constructed an elaborate narrative to justify his actions, transforming personal revenge into a moral crusade. The letter was sent for analysis to Charleston, where experts examined the paper, ink, and postmark. The paper was common, sold in hundreds of establishments throughout West Virginia. The ink also offered no particular clues. The Helvetia postmark indicated the letter had been mailed 3 days before arriving in Hillsdale. Authorities searched the town, but no one recalled seeing a man matching Lawrence's description. Klein personally visited Helvetia, a unique community with a strong Swiss influence, where many residents still spoke Swiss German in addition to English. The village was small, with only a few dozen residences scattered throughout a picturesque valley. The detective spoke with residents, visited the post office, and examined guest records at the few local inns. He found no evidence that Lawrence had actually been there. Klein's hypothesis was that Lawrence had used an intermediary to post the letter, possibly paying a traveler to take the envelope to Helvetia and drop it off. This meant Lawrence was somewhere completely different, using disinformation tactics to keep investigators chasing shadows. The sophistication of the plan only reinforced the image of a meticulous and cautious man. The case was beginning to weigh heavily on everyone involved. Klein, who had initially anticipated a quick resolution after identifying the suspect, now faced the frustrating reality that finding a man determined to disappear in the vastness of the Appalachian Mountains was a Herculean task. Sheriff Fletcher felt pressure from the community, which wanted closure and security. Months had passed since the discoveries at the hunting station and the abandoned mine, but the perpetrator remained at large, possibly observing every move from some secret hideout. The fall of 1908 arrived, bringing with it a heavy atmosphere over Hillsdale. A year had passed since Catherine Morrison's disappearance, and despite all the progress in the investigation, Lawrence Ashford remained elusive. Frustration had set in, not only among the searchers, but throughout the community. People began to look at the surrounding mountains with a mixture of reverence and dread, wondering if the sought-after man still roamed those dense forests or had already escaped to distant lands. Klein decided to change his approach. Instead of pursuing Lawrence through increasingly rare sightings and clues, he began to deeply study the fugitive's psychology. He spent hours rereading the diary found at the hunting station and the letter sent from Helvetia, trying to penetrate the mind of a man who had managed to transform personal pain into justification for terrible acts. The detective began consulting alienists, researchers of human behavior in Charleston and even Washington, D.C., seeking to better understand the profile of someone capable of plotting revenge for years. One of the experts consulted Dr. Heinrich Fischer, a professor of psychiatry who had immigrated from Germany a decade earlier, offered disturbing insights. According to Fischer, Lawrence displayed characteristics of what European scholars were beginning to call obsessive monomania, a pathological fixation on a single idea or goal that completely dominates the individual's existence. People with this condition often possessed superior intelligence and a seemingly normal capacity to function in society, but internally maintained a delusional narrative that justified extreme behavior. Fisher explained that such individuals rarely abandoned their obsessions even after achieving their goals. Revenge against Catherine might have been satisfied, but Lawrence would likely develop new fixations or simply continue to mentally relive his actions, feeding on the feeling of having righted an injustice. The doctor suggested that Lawrence might eventually feel the need to share his story more fully, to have others understand and validate his perspective. This need could lead him to make mistakes and expose himself unintentionally. Klein considered this analysis carefully. He decided to publish articles in regional newspapers, not only reporting the facts of the investigation, but deliberately portraying Lawrence in a way that challenged his self-image as a vigilante. The articles portrayed him as a man who had fled the law, who hid in the shadows as a common criminal, who lacked the courage to confront the justice system he claimed had failed him. It was a risky strategy designed to provoke an emotional reaction that might lead Lawrence to slip up. The response was not long in coming. 3 weeks after the articles were published, another letter arrived, this time posted in Elkins, a considerably larger town northeast of Hillsdale. The handwriting was again Lawrence's, but the tone was notably different. There was anger in the words, an indignation not present in the previous letter. Lawrence accused Klein of deliberately distorting the truth, of painting him as a coward, when in reality he had demonstrated courage few possess. "You call me a fugitive," Lawrence wrote, "but you forget that it is those who administer imperfect justice who should flee from shame. Did I hide? No, Mr. Klein. I simply removed myself from the presence of a corrupt system that protects the guilty when they possess the right connections, the right social standing, or simply the good fortune to be in the right place when judgments are made. Catherine Harper killed my father, not by accident, not by incompetence, but by deliberate experimentation with methods that no sanctioned physician would approve." The letter continued, revealing details that Lawrence claimed to have uncovered during his personal investigation. He claimed to have found, years after Gregory Ashford's death, records that Catherine had secretly kept, notes on experiments with different combinations of herbs and substances administered to patients at the charity hospital. According to Lawrence, his search had led him to other suspicious cases, other deaths that could be linked to Catherine's unconventional treatments. He portrayed her not as a dedicated nurse, but as someone who had used her position to satisfy a morbid, scientific curiosity. Klein wasn't sure how much of these accounts were true, and how much were the delusions of an obsessed mind. He sent investigators to Staunton again, asking them to dig deeper into hospital records, looking for any evidence to support Lawrence's claims. What they found was ambiguous. There had indeed been a statistically unusual number of deaths at the hospital during Catherine's time there, but the recorded causes were consistent with the serious illnesses afflicting the patients. Nothing clearly suggested wrongdoing, but nothing completely ruled it out either. The enigma of who Catherine Morrison really was began to haunt Klein as much as the mystery of where Lawrence Ashford was. Could Lawrence have been right that Catherine had indeed committed questionable acts during her years as a nurse? Or was it all the projection of a man unable to accept that sometimes medicine simply fails, that people die despite the best efforts to save them? The truth likely lay somewhere in between, obscured by time and conflicting perspectives. While Klein grappled with these philosophical questions, Sheriff Fletcher kept his focus on practical matters. Elkins's letter provided a new geographical clue. Authorities in that town were alerted, and a search was organized. Again, no concrete trace of Lawrence was found, but an interesting detail emerged. A clerk at the Elkins train station remembered a man with a similar description buying a ticket to Grafton a few weeks earlier. The clerk had noticed, because the man had paid in old coins, many of them dated decades ago, as if he had been carrying around years of savings. Grafton was a major railroad junction connecting several lines running in multiple directions. From there, Lawrence could have traveled virtually anywhere in the northeastern United States. Klein sent urgent telegrams to authorities in Grafton, but it was too late. Weeks had passed, and tracking a single passenger among the hundreds who passed through the station daily was an impossible task. Investigation seemed to be winding down again when an unexpected development added a new dimension to the case. In November 1908, an article appeared in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, written by someone using the pseudonym Veritas. The article was extensive, taking up almost a full page, and detailed the story of Lawrence Ashford and Catherine Morrison, but from a completely different perspective than that presented in the West Virginia press. The author of Veritas portrayed Lawrence Press as a victim of a corrupt judicial system that had protected a dangerous woman. The article included citations from documents purportedly proving Catherine's negligence in the Gregory Ashford case, as well as insinuations about other patients who had died under her care. It also fiercely criticized Klein and Fletcher's work, accusing them of persecuting an innocent man while ignoring the real transgressions that had occurred years earlier. Klein immediately traveled to Pittsburgh upon hearing about the article. At the Post-Gazette headquarters, he demanded information about who had submitted the article. The editors explained that the article had arrived in the mail, accompanied by a payment in cash sufficient to cover the publication costs. There was no return address, only an enclosed letter requesting that the article be printed exactly as submitted, without edits. The editors, intrigued by the story, and finding that the main allegations could be verified through public records, decided to publish it. The handwriting on the letter accompanying the article was again Lawrence Ashford's. He was now using the press as a platform, attempting to shape the public narrative in his favor. Klein realized that Lawrence wasn't simply on the run. He was waging a propaganda campaign seeking to transform himself from a wanted criminal into a symbol of justice. Failed. It was a bold and dangerous strategy, as every contact with public institutions created opportunities for tracking. The Pittsburgh article generated mixed reactions. Some readers expressed sympathy for Lawrence's story, questioning whether the justice system had truly failed to punish Catherine adequately. Others were outraged by what they perceived as an attempt to justify violence through intellectual sophistry. The debate spilled over from the pages of newspapers to be discussed in saloons, taverns, and churches throughout the region. Klein used the publicity as an opportunity to intensify the search once again. He gave interviews to several newspapers, not only reiterating that Lawrence was wanted for serious crimes, but also appealing directly to him through the media. Lawrence Ashford, Klein said in a widely reprinted interview, "If you truly believe that justice is on your side, then come forward. Allow a jury of citizens to hear your story and judge your merits. Hiding in the shadows while proclaiming your innocence is not the act of a man convinced of his righteousness. It is the behavior of someone who knows deep down that his actions would not stand up to the scrutiny of law and morality." The winter of 1908. Heavy snowfall blocked roads and isolated entire communities for weeks at a time. The search for Lawrence Ashford became virtually impossible during these icy months, forcing Klein and Fletcher to redirect their efforts to analysis and planning. The detective took up temporary residence in Hillsdale, converting a room in the local police station into an operations center where detailed maps of the region covered the walls marked with colored pins, indicating confirmed and suspected sightings. Letter posting locations and areas where Lawrence might be hiding. During this period of relative enforced inactivity, Klein dedicated himself to deepening his understanding of both protagonists of this tragedy. He traveled back to Eastern Virginia as soon as weather permitted, this time determined to uncover absolutely everything about Catherine's past. His investigation took him to small towns and villages where Catherine had lived before settling in Staunton, tracing a life that was beginning to reveal unexpected complexities. Catherine Harper was born in 1875 in Shenandoah County, the daughter of Irish immigrants who had fled the Great Famine decades earlier. Her family was humble, working as sharecroppers on land they could never call their own. Catherine's mother, Margaret Harper, had a local reputation as a traditional healer, knowledgeable in herbal remedies passed down through generations. It was from her that Catherine learned the foundations of her medicinal knowledge, practices that blended empirical observation with ancient traditions. Klein discovered that Catherine had demonstrated an insatiable curiosity about the workings of the human body and the properties of plants from a young age. Old neighbors remembered her as a remarkably intelligent girl, always asking questions, always observing intently as her mother prepared medicines or tended to the sick. At a time when formal education for women was limited, especially in poor, rural communities, Catherine sought knowledge through any means available. She attended a small parochial school until she was 14, after which she had to work to help support her family. A retired physician, Klein, located in Winchester, provided revealing information. Dr. Samuel Pritchard, then in his 70s, clearly remembered Catherine. Around 1893, when she was 18, Catherine had appeared in his office asking to work as an assistant. She had no formal credentials, but demonstrated impressive knowledge of basic anatomy and traditional treatments. Pritchard, always in need of help and impressed by the young woman's enthusiasm, hired her informally. During the 2 years she worked for Pritchard, Catherine absorbed medical knowledge with extraordinary veracity. The doctor allowed her to read his medical books, explained procedures as he performed them, and discussed complex diagnoses with her as if she were a colleague rather than just an assistant. Pritchard revealed to Klein that Catherine possessed a genuinely scientific mind, always questioning, always seeking to understand not just the how but the why of treatments. She also showed particular interest in cases where conventional medicine failed, questioning whether alternative approaches might offer solutions. This revelation shed new light on Lawrence's claims. Could it be that Catherine, frustrated with the limitations of contemporary medicine, had indeed experimented with unorthodox treatments? Pritchard admitted that he had occasionally warned Catherine about her tendency to improve established treatments, incorporating elements of traditional herbal remedies without formal medical approval. He did not believe she acted maliciously. but he acknowledged that her confidence in her own knowledge sometimes exceeded her actual experience. In 1895, Catherine left Pritchard's employment and moved to Staunton, where she secured a position at the charity hospital. Pritchard wrote a letter of recommendation for her, albeit with certain reservations that he did not fully explain in the document. He liked Catherine and believed in her potential, but he also recognized that she needed adequate supervision and an institutional structure to channel her ambitions appropriately. Catherine's time at Staunton from 1895 to 1898 remained the most murky and controversial of her life. Klein was able to locate other employees who had worked at the hospital during those years. Their memories of Catherine varied dramatically. Some remembered her as a dedicated and compassionate nurse who often stayed beyond her shift, caring for critically ill patients. Others mentioned that she had a reputation for occasional insubordination, questioning doctors' orders when she disagreed with prescribed treatments. A former hospital doctor, now retired and living in Richmond, provided the most detailed and troubling testimony. He specifically recalled the Gregory Ashford case and the circumstances surrounding it. According to this doctor, Catherine had indeed suggested alternative treatments when conventional medications failed to produce immediate improvement. Pressured by his influential family and desperate to save the patient, he had allowed Catherine to try his methods, something he would normally disapprove of. The doctor admitted with evident discomfort, even so many years later, that he never fully understood what Catherine had administered to Ashford. She had mentioned combinations of herbal extracts that supposedly stimulated the immune system, but the specifics remained vague. When Ashford passed away, the doctor faced severe questioning from the family. To protect his own reputation and medical license, he had attributed primary responsibility to Catherine, claiming she had acted without his proper supervision, which technically was not true. This confession greatly complicated the narrative. Lawrence Ashford was not entirely wrong in suspecting that something irregular had occurred during his father's treatment. There had indeed been unauthorized experimentation, treatments administered without proper protocols. However, the complicity of the attending physician, who later betrayed her to save his own career, suggested that Catherine had been partly a scapegoat for a medical system that had allowed the situation and then denied responsibility. When things went wrong, Klein felt increasingly trapped in a moral maze. The search for Lawrence Ashford, which had begun as a straightforward pursuit of a criminal, now revealed itself as a tragically complex story of systemic failures, misguided ambitions, and genuine grief transformed into destructive obsession. Catherine was not the innocent saint some in Hillsdale imagined, but neither was she the deliberate killer Lawrence painted her as. Lawrence was not simply a vengeful madman, but a man who had suffered real loss and uncovered inconvenient truths the system had preferred to bury. This complexity didn't change the fundamental facts. However, regardless of what Catherine had or hadn't done in 1897, she hadn't deserved the fate Lawrence had meted out to her in 1907. No past transgressions, real or imagined, justified what was documented in the diary found at the hunting lodge. The cold, meticulous planning of revenge that had consumed years of Lawrence's life. Klein needed to remind himself of this constantly, for the more he learned about the past, the more he understood Lawrence's perspective, and understanding couldn't be allowed to turn into sympathy that would compromise his resolve. The spring of 1909 brought renewal to the mountains and renewed vigor to the investigation. Klein expanded his network of informants, establishing contacts with railroad stations, hotels, boarding houses, and taverns throughout the region. He distributed old photographs of Lawrence Ashford obtained through Vincent, urging business owners to be on the lookout. He offered a substantial reward for information leading to his capture, funded partly by county funds and partly by an anonymous donation from a wealthy Hillsdale resident who wanted to see the case solved. On April, there was finally substantial progress. A boarding house owner in Cumberland, Maryland, contacted local authorities, reporting that a man matching Lawrence's description had stayed at his establishment for 3 weeks in February. The guest had registered under an obviously false name, paid in cash, and kept to himself, leaving only occasionally to buy provisions. What caught the owner's attention was that the man spent entire days writing, filling notebooks with dense handwriting, and that, after his departure, a notebook had been found forgotten under the mattress. Klein immediately traveled to Cumberland. The forgotten notebook proved to be an extraordinary testament to Lawrence Ashford's mind. Unlike the previously discovered diary, which documented his planning and observations about Catherine, this notebook contained profound philosophical reflections on justice, morality, and the role of the individual when social institutions fail. Lawrence wrote long essays exploring ideas from thinkers from Plato to his contemporaries, attempting to construct an intellectual framework that would validate his actions. One particularly revealing passage read, "Society establishes laws to maintain order. But when these same laws protect the guilty and punish the innocent through their imperfections, the conscious individual faces an existential dilemma. To blindly submit to the imperfect system is to abdicate personal moral responsibility. To act outside the system is to risk being condemned as a criminal. Yet of these options, only the second preserves the integrity of the soul. I would rather be hunted as a criminal, knowing that I acted justly, than live free as a coward who allowed injustice to persist unchallenged." The notebook found in Cumberland provided Klein with more than just philosophical insights. Hidden among the abstract musings were subtle geographical references that the detective had learned to recognize. Lawrence mentioned mountains that embrace the West Rivers that flow into the Great Ohio, and towns where black coal fuels industrial furnaces. These poetic descriptions, when carefully analyzed, suggested that Lawrence had moved through the mountainous region between Maryland and western Pennsylvania, possibly toward the mining areas around Pittsburgh. Klein coordinated a discreet but comprehensive surveillance with Pennsylvania authorities. Posters with Lawrence's photograph were distributed to sheriffs in counties along the Monongahela River and its tributaries. The description emphasized that the wanted man was an educated man, likely working in occupations that did not require intense physical strength, possibly as a clerk, accountant, or tutor. Lawrence needed jobs that allowed him mobility and relative anonymity, but also covered his basic living expenses. During the summer of 1909, possible sightings came in from various locations. A substitute teacher in Uniontown matched the description and demonstrated impressive knowledge, but when investigated, he turned out to be a recently arrived German immigrant with complete documentation. A clerk in Connellsville also aroused suspicion due to his reserved demeanor. But further investigation proved he was simply a shy man with a verifiable past. Each false alarm consumed precious time and resources. But Klein insisted on investigating each lead meticulously. Perseverance eventually paid off. In September 1909, almost 2 years after Catherine Morrison's disappearance, a Fayette County sheriff reported a peculiar situation. A man working as a private tutor for the children of a wealthy mining family in Brownsville was behaving strangely. He was extremely competent at his job, teaching not only basic subjects but also Latin philosophy and natural science. However, he refused social invitations, never discussed his past, and seemed constantly vigilant, as if expecting discovery at any moment. The sheriff, a shrewd man named Daniel Kowalski, decided to approach the situation subtly. Instead of confronting the tutor directly, he fabricated a pretext for visiting him, claiming that the family he worked for wanted additional references before renewing his contract. During the seemingly casual conversation, Kowalski observed revealing details. The tutor's hand showed no calluses from heavy manual labor, but there were permanent ink stains on his fingers, consistent with someone who wrote extensively. His diction was refined, his vocabulary impressive, but there was an underlying nervousness in his eyes that betrayed a constant state of alertness. Kowalski asked where the tutor came from before arriving in Brownsville. The man hesitated briefly before responding that he had lived in various locations, working wherever opportunities arose. When pressed about specific locations, he gave vague answers that could not be easily verified. The sheriff also noticed that the tutor avoided looking directly at the photograph of Lawrence Ashford that was purposefully placed on the sheriff's desk during the conversation, as if he recognized the image but struggled not to show it. Convinced he had found the man he was looking for, Kowalski didn't act rashly. He knew Lawrence was intelligent and cautious, capable of disappearing at the slightest sign of danger. Instead, the sheriff established discreet surveillance, positioning deputies in strategic locations to monitor the Guardian's movements. Simultaneously, he sent an urgent telegram to Klein, requesting that he come to Brownsville immediately for definitive identification. Klein arrived 3 days later, traveling through the night to reach Pennsylvania as quickly as possible. Kowalski briefed him on the situation, and together they devised a capture plan. They couldn't risk a public confrontation that could result in violence or allow Lawrence to escape again. They decided to approach him early in the morning as he left his residence to head to the family home where he taught. The morning of September 23, 1909, dawned with dense fog blanketing the Monongahela River Valley. Klein and Kowalski, accompanied by 3 armed deputies, strategically positioned themselves along the route their guardian traveled daily. The tension was palpable as they waited, each man aware that Lawrence might be armed and that 2 years of life as a fugitive might have made him desperate and unpredictable. When the guardian emerged from his lodging promptly at 7 o'clock in the morning, Klein felt an immediate recognition, even from a distance and through the fog. The way the man moved, his erect, watchful posture, matched the descriptions he had accumulated over months of investigation. They allowed him about 100 meters before closing in, approaching from multiple directions simultaneously to cut off escape routes. Lawrence sensed the trap moments before he was surrounded. His body stiffened, and for a moment it seemed he might try to run. Klein stepped forward, keeping his hands visible and his voice calm. "Lawrence Ashford," he said clearly. "My name is Edward Klein. I'm here to take you back to West Virginia to answer for your actions. There need be no violence. You're an intelligent man. You know there's nowhere to run." The confrontation lasted only seconds, but to those present it seemed to stretch on indefinitely. Lawrence looked around, evaluating his options, calculating the odds. His eyes met Klein's, and in that moment the detective saw not the monster he had imagined during months of pursuit, but an exhausted man, consumed by years of obsession and isolation. Finally, Lawrence slumped his shoulders in surrender. "I always knew this day would come," he said in a surprisingly calm voice. "Maybe it's even relief." The arrest was carried out without resistance. When Kowalski placed handcuffs on Lawrence's wrists, the prisoner didn't protest. He simply looked up at the sky, still tinted with the colors of dawn, and murmured something Klein couldn't quite hear, but which sounded like a prayer or a farewell. A search of his belongings revealed little beyond simple clothing, a few philosophy books, and 3 notebooks filled with the distinctive handwriting Klein had come to know so well from the documents found throughout the investigation. News of the capture spread quickly. Telegrams were sent to Hillsdale, where Sheriff Fletcher received the information with satisfaction mixed with relief. The community that had lived under the shadow of this mystery for nearly 2 years could finally begin to seek some form of closure. Newspapers across the region carried headlines announcing that the man wanted in connection with Catherine Morrison's disappearance was finally in custody. During the trip back to West Virginia, Lawrence remained largely silent. Klein repeatedly attempted to engage him in conversation, hoping to elicit a confession or at least more details about the events of October 1907. Lawrence responded only with philosophical generalities, refusing to provide specifics that might legally incriminate him. It was clear that despite his physical surrender, he had no intention of facilitating the upcoming trial. Upon arriving in Hillsdale, a considerable crowd awaited at the police station. Some onlookers simply wanted to see the man who had become a near mythical figure during the months of searching. Others, friends and acquaintances of Catherine, came driven by darker feelings, anger, and a desire for revenge written all over their faces. Sheriff Fletcher had to organize a secure corridor to ensure Lawrence reached his cell without incident. Housed in the small Hillsdale prison, Lawrence Ashford would finally face the justice system he had despised. Charleston lawyers were contacted, and trial preparations began to take shape. But everyone involved knew the real challenge was yet to come. With abundant circumstantial evidence, but no direct confession or definitive discovery of Catherine's body, the case would not be as straightforward as it initially seemed. Lawrence, even in captivity, remained an enigma, a man whose guilt was morally certain but legally complex to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Autumn returned to the Appalachian Mountains, completing 2 years since that fateful morning, when Catherine Morrison set out following a false messenger toward her tragic destiny. The trees, once again dressed in red and gold, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding beneath their ancient canopies. And in the deep shadows of the mountains, secrets still lay buried, waiting perhaps never to be fully revealed. Lawrence Ashford's trial was scheduled for early September. giving attorneys on both sides time to prepare their cases. The prosecution would be led by the Greenbrier County District Attorney, an experienced man named Albert Harrison, known for his eloquent rhetoric and meticulous preparation. Lawrence's defense was handled by a Charleston attorney named Theodore Mansfield, who took the case not out of sympathy for the accused, but out of a belief that even the most despised deserved adequate legal representation, in the weeks leading up to the trial. Hillsdale became a regional center of attention. Journalists from dozens of publications settled in the small town, filling the local inns and taverns. The case had captured the public imagination, not only for the nature of the alleged crime, but also for the moral and philosophical questions it raised. In saloons and town squares across West Virginia, people debated whether a man could justify revenge when the judicial system had failed to deliver justice, whether the end justified the means, whether Lawrence Ashford was a villain or a victim of tragic circumstances. Klein spent this period meticulously reviewing every piece of evidence, preparing to testify. He compiled a detailed chronology of events from Gregory Ashford's death in 1897 to Lawrence's capture in Brownsville. The diaries, letters, witness statements, and discoveries at the hunting station and the abandoned mine were all cataloged and prepared for presentation in court. The prosecution knew that without a body or an explicit confession, they would need to build a circumstantial case so compelling that it would leave no reasonable doubt in the jurors' minds. The defense, for its part, was preparing a bold strategy. Mansfield planned not to completely deny Lawrence's involvement in the events, but rather to contextualize his actions within a framework of unmet justice and extreme psychological suffering. He intended to present Lawrence as a man who had suffered a gradual mental breakdown after his father's death, consumed by grief that the legal system had failed to adequately acknowledge. This was a risky strategy, as it required admitting certain actions while arguing that mitigating circumstances should result in a lesser sentence. Lawrence, surprisingly, was uncooperative in his own defense. In conversations with Mansfield, he insisted that he did not wish to be portrayed as mentally impaired or incapable of controlling his actions. He wanted the court and the world to understand that he had acted consciously and deliberately, motivated not by insanity but by profound moral principles. Mansfield argued that this stance was legal suicide, but Lawrence remained adamant. He seemed more interested in being understood than in being acquitted. The trial began on a cold December morning with light snow falling over Hillsdale. The courtroom was packed far beyond its normal capacity, with people standing in the hallways and even outside waiting for news of the proceedings. Judge Harold Preston, a respected judge with over 20 years of experience, presided with calm authority, determined to ensure the trial was conducted with appropriate dignity despite the media circus surrounding it. Jury selection took 3 full days. Harrison and Mansfield questioned each candidate extensively, seeking to identify biases that might influence the verdict. Finally, 12 men were selected, representing a variety of occupations and backgrounds, all of whom swore under oath that they could judge the case based solely on the evidence presented, not on speculation or personal feelings. The opening statements drew dramatic contrasts between the prosecution and defense narratives. Harrison portrayed Lawrence as a calculating predator who had spent years plotting cruel revenge against an innocent woman, using manipulative techniques to lure her into a deadly trap deep in the mountains. Mansfield responded by portraying Lawrence as a man broken by the system who had watched helplessly as the woman responsible for his father's death escaped consequences, eventually driving him to a desperate act he would never have committed under normal circumstances. Kline's testimony was a pivotal moment in the trial. For 2 full days, he detailed the investigation from the moment Catherine was reported missing to Lawrence's capture in Brownsville. His narrative was methodical and compelling, building the case step by step, evidence by evidence. He presented the diary found at the hunting station, reading passages that clearly demonstrated premeditation and intent. He presented the letters Lawrence had sent, revealing his mental state and veiled admissions. He described the discoveries in the abandoned mine, carefully avoiding graphic details, but making clear that disturbing evidence had been found. Under cross-examination from Mansfield, Kline admitted that no evidence conclusively proved that Lawrence had killed Catherine with his own hands. It was possible, the defense argued, that she had gotten lost in the mountains after meeting with Lawrence, that perhaps he had simply confronted her about her past without causing direct physical harm. Kline, however, stood firm, pointing out that the totality of the evidence, when considered together, left no reasonable alternative interpretation. Dorothy Reynolds, Catherine's elderly housekeeper, gave emotional testimony about the alleged cousin's visit, identifying Lawrence in court as the man who had appeared that day. Vincent Ashford traveled from Staunton to testify about his brother's obsession with the case, about how Lawrence had distanced himself from the family after the legal case against Catherine was dropped. Each witness added layers to the portrait of a man consumed by revenge for years. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when the defense called Lawrence Ashford to testify in his own defense. Mansfield had repeatedly warned that it was a risky decision, that Lawrence should remain silent and allow the defense to proceed without exposing him to Harrison's devastating cross-examination. But Lawrence had insisted, and now he took the witness stand with a calm, almost serene expression. Under gentle questioning from Mansfield, Lawrence told his side of the story. He described his father's death not as an unfortunate medical accident, but as a direct result of Catherine Harper's irresponsible experimentation. He spoke of years of investigation, of documents he had uncovered, of patterns of behavior he had identified. His voice remained controlled, almost professorial, as if he were delivering an academic lecture on justice and morality rather than testifying at his own murder trial. When it came to the topic of October 1907, Lawrence became more cautious. He admitted sending a false messenger to lure Catherine away from Hillsdale. He admitted confronting her at the abandoned hunting station, forcing her to listen as he detailed his discoveries about what she had done years before. But when Mansfield asked directly what had happened next, Lawrence paused for a long time before answering enigmatically. There is justice that courts administer, and there is justice that the universe demands. On that day, in the mountains that hold all secrets, balance was restored. Harrison attacked ferociously during cross-examination. He pressed Lawrence for specifics, for details the defendant refused to provide. He pointed out contradictions between various statements Lawrence had made over the years. He confronted him with passages from his diaries that demonstrated cold, calculated planning, not action born of momentary desperation. Lawrence met each attack with frustrating calm, never losing his composure, but also never providing the full confession the prosecution sought. Closing arguments lasted all day. Harrison constructed a powerful synthesis of all the evidence, arguing that only one rational conclusion was possible. Lawrence Ashford had lured Catherine Morrison to a remote location with the premeditated intent to take her life, executing a plan he had developed for years. Mansfield responded with an emotional appeal, asking the jury to consider the full context, Lawrence's suffering, and the systemic failures that led him to that point. He did not ask for an acquittal, but rather for mitigating circumstances that warranted mercy. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The weight of the decision was evident on the faces of the 12 men when they returned to the courtroom. The verdict, when finally announced, was guilty of premeditated murder. The courtroom erupted in mixed reactions, some applauding the decision, others murmuring disapproval. Lawrence received the verdict without visible emotion, simply nodding slightly, as if confirming his long-held expectation. The sentence was handed down a week later. Judge Preston, in a carefully crafted statement, acknowledged the complexity of the case, but stated that the law did not permit private revenge, regardless of how justified the perpetrator believed it to be. He sentenced Lawrence Ashford to life in prison at the Moundsville State Penitentiary. There would be no possibility of parole. Lawrence would spend the rest of his days behind bars, paying for what he had done on that dark October day in the Appalachian Mountains. Lawrence was transferred to Moundsville in January 1910. Prison records show that he remained a model prisoner for the next few years, spending time in the prison library, where he eventually became an informal assistant to the librarian. He continued writing extensively, producing philosophical musings that some considered brilliant and others saw as the rationalizations of a disturbed mind. None of these writings were published during his lifetime, remaining archived in prison records. Edward Klein returned to his private practice in Charleston, but the Catherine Morrison case would haunt him for the rest of his career. He never obtained the full confession he desired, never recovered Catherine's body for proper burial. The Appalachian Mountains held their deepest secrets, and Klein knew questions would remain forever unanswered. Years later, in his unpublished memoirs, he would write that the case taught him that truth is rarely absolute, that justice is a concept more complex than any legal code can capture. The story of Catherine Morrison and Lawrence Ashford became part of the local folklore of the Appalachian Mountains. Later generations would tell increasingly distorted versions of the events, transforming real people into near mythical figures. Some portrayed Catherine as a miraculous healer, unjustly persecuted. Others painted her as a witch, experimenting with dark forces. Lawrence was alternately a monstrous villain and a tragic vigilante. The truth, as always, resided in a more nuanced and uncomfortable place than any simplified narrative could capture. The Appalachian Mountains still stand, unmoved by the human tragedies they have witnessed over the centuries. The trails Catherine walked that final morning still exist, now covered in layers of fallen leaves from over a century ago. The hunting station, where the final confrontation took place, collapsed decades ago, reclaimed by the forest that always surrounded it. The abandoned mine, where evidence was found, has collapsed, forever sealing whatever still remained within its depths. The case remains officially closed in the Greenbrier County records. But the questions it raises continue to resonate about justice and revenge, about what individuals should do when systems fail, about how unprocessed grief can turn into destructive obsession, about the limits of human understanding in the face of complex motivations and ambiguous morality. These are questions without easy answers, as old as humanity itself, as relevant today as they were in that distant autumn of 1907. If this journey through the shadows of history touched you in any way, if the complexities of this Appalachian tragedy left you pondering the nature of justice and the depths of the human heart, consider subscribing to our channel. Leave a like if you enjoyed how we peeled back the layers of this disturbing mystery. And in the comments, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Was Lawrence Ashford a villain or a victim? Can an obsession with justice ever justify terrible acts? Share your thoughts with us. Until the next story, the mountains hold in their eternal shadows.